is broadcasting. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming in. I'm going to wait just a few more minutes as people are coming into the presentation. Thank you so much for being here on the USGBC's 2030 District's first Cannabis Sustainability Webinar Series. It'll be the first of many, so make sure that you mark your calendars for this time for the next couple of weeks, because we're going to be going through consistently on what are the requirements, the targets, the objectives, the regulations for the cannabis industry in Grand Rapids, as well as what you do as a business to make yourself more sustainable, have a better energy management plan, and prepare yourself for a resilient future, because that's what the city is all about. I want to thank Kristen and Ciara and Lou for coming to speak today on just a broad overview of the requirements from a licensing perspective, social equity and zoning requirements. And for folks who are just joining, maybe some of you have been on our Healthy Building webinar series before, so you're familiar with that. When you use the chat box, make sure you're aware of what you're sending to just the panelists and what you're sending to all the attendees. In addition, if you have specific questions, use the Q&A. We'll be making sure that all of that stuff gets sorted so that the panelists can answer those at the end of the webinar. I always forget to introduce myself. My name is Jillian Gam. I'm the program manager of the U.S. Green Building Council. If you want to be sending me an email, it's literally my first name at usgbcwm.org. The speakers we have today are Kristen Turkelson, the planning director for the City of Grand Rapids, Ciara Adkins, the equity analyst and an attorney at law, the City of Grand Rapids as well, and Lou Canfield is a development center manager for the City of Grand Rapids. They have a lot of information to share with you today, so I'm not going to take up any more time, but thank you three very much for coming on the call today. So I'm going to turn it over to you folks, whenever you're ready to share your slides.
Thank you, Jillian. We appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon. And while our slide presentation is being pulled up, I do want to note that the City of Grand Rapids is also hosting an information session on Thursday at 10 a.m. and it is much of the same content. However, we will also provide an opportunity for Q&A. So there might be a little bit of redundancy, but we thought providing two opportunities for either the industry or the community to learn about the recent changes was a benefit. So if you're interested in participating in that or would like more information, please feel free to visit the city's website or the city's Facebook page. Next slide, please. So the City of Grand Rapids has recently amended the different policies and zoning ordinances relative to marijuana. So back in, I believe it was 2018, the city did adopt a zoning ordinance that authorized land use for medical marijuana facilities. And with the changes at the state level, when the state allowed for recreational marijuana sales and grow and processing, the city began working on an ordinance amendment and policy amendments that would allow for recreational marijuana to be sold in the City of Grand Rapids. So it's been a lot of discussion through the end of 2019, and in January, the Planning Commission did consider the item and send a recommendation to City Commission about what land use regulations would apply to the new recreational marijuana facilities. So City Commission on February 25th did have a very robust discussion and ultimately decided that additional discussion was needed, especially as it related to opportunities to advance equity within the cannabis industry or for the cannabis industry. So in March, we did have to go back to the City Commission to request a bit of a delay. We were originally supposed to accept applications in April. However, we needed 6 months to work on the equity policy and also changes to the land use regulations for recreational marijuana. Ultimately, this week, on July 7th, we did adopt amendments to both the zoning ordinance, the licensing ordinance, and we adopted a cannabis social equity plan that we'll be discussing today. So that was a significant change an advancement in our regulations for recreational marijuana. We will begin to accept applications for the non-retail aspect of the cannabis industry for recreational cannabis beginning on July 20th. That is a window, and we'll describe that a little bit more shortly. And then in September 1st, we will begin accepting applications. That will be the application window for the recreational cannabis applications that are eligible, what we call for special land use, which is really largely centered on the retail cannabis industry. So this shows the timeline that we've been working under since the February 25th meeting that I've mentioned. There are multiple parts to the work that we have been doing. We have the equity policy that is shown in orange on the timeline. There is also an effort to establish a nonprofit. We will not be further greatly discussing that in further detail today, but there is also work to establish a nonprofit that can pick up some of the equity work that may not be appropriate for the city to embark upon. I mentioned that we also have a city licensing, business licensing ordinance requirements for cannabis, and that is largely where we will have the requirements for the environmental sustainability requirements within the licensing ordinance, and then the zoning. The zoning was actually split into multiple processes. We called one the fast track process, or what were the low-hanging fruits, the items that we knew we had consensus on. Again, that largely centered on the non-retail or more of the industrial aspects of the cannabis industry, such as the growers or processors. However, it did allow for some co-location or did provide land use regulations for retail, recreational retailers. And there are some additional work that we do have in what we're calling the deliberative track. And that discussion is set for to begin on July 21st. And that is for the items where we still need some additional conversation and before we can achieve some consensus. The goal being October 19th, as you noted in that timeline, that we intend to have all of these policies completely done with the deliberative track specifically by October 20th. So with that, I will turn it over to Sierra to further explain what our cannabis social equity policy is.
Thank you, Kristen. So very excited to talk to you all about our cannabis social equity policy. As you can see, we tried to make it look really nice, and it has just come through our city commission. It is a formal policy within our municipality. Next slide, please. So what is an equity policy? So this policy was some really intensive work that took place by the Cannabis Justice Work Group. And it looks at recreational cannabis, it looks at the entire industry through an equity lens. And we had to take some time and figure out what is our vision. And we want to uplift new members of our community who've historically been disenfranchised through the negative effects of marijuana, war on drugs, etc. So we wanted to make sure that this group is now welcome into this industry. And then we also want to encourage participants in the recreational cannabis industry to follow these policy recommendations because we're really trying to promote a more equitable industry. Next slide, please. So how does this policy work? Again, it took a lot of strategic guidance for us to get to where we are today. So we had to look at what is our circle of control, circle of influence, circle of concern. So as the city of Grand Rapids, our circle of control is really within regulatory pieces. So our zoning ordinance, licensing, cannabis social equity policy, we're able to push those things through. Now, because we're a public entity and we have limitations on public funds, our circle of influence and circle of concern are a little different. So we can have some influence with organizations and seek out help with trying to pursue some of those equity goals that we have. And then the circle of concern is really everyone here. So our circle of concern is equity, is justice, is economy, and all of those things entail all of us. So really it's a collaborative effort to make sure that we can put all these spheres together to create a great policy for this work. Next slide, please. So high-level elements of the policy, we have our equity components and definitions. We tried to lay it out in a very friendly framework. Then we have our equity categories for the application process. Then we go into detail for the equity point system, application process, and prioritization system. And then we conclude with implementation, compliance, and enforcement of the policy. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important before we go any further to know why we use the term cannabis versus marijuana. We're trying to be rooted in equity in all that we do. So we are intentional with the word cannabis. It's a scientific name for the plant, and it removes historical stigma and negative connotations. So typically across the nation, you are going to see the word cannabis wherever possible in social equity programs. Because the term marijuana, contrarily, it has an international origin, and it has been historically used to stigmatize brown and Black communities. And that's not the way we want to go with this work. It was introduced into our lexicon in the 1930s via the Marijuana Act of 1937, and you'll typically see it used in legal and zoning frameworks. So if at any point you see us use those terms interchangeably, it's because in one area we have the opportunity to be leaders in the industry, so we use cannabis, and then sometimes due to legal references, we will use the term marijuana. Next slide, please. So a couple of definitions to highlight. We have several definitions in this equity policy, but we definitely want to highlight a few of them for you all today. So social equity, the product of successfully removing and preventing barriers created by systemic and institutional justice. And then the equity applicant. This was really important to us because we were very intentional about how we're going to bring individuals into the industry. So we have a lot of criteria that we established that will help individuals figure out their equity applicant status. So we look at socioeconomic status, harm, cannabis convictions, residency, and a lot of other criteria and demographics that can help people figure out if they can fall into that equity applicant category. Contrarily, advancing equity, because we know not everyone who wants to apply into work in this industry will have a negative history or harm associated with the marijuana industry, such as an equity applicant will. So applications advancing equity have the opportunity to make positive change for equity in the industry via commitments to advance equity through the initiatives that we see. So they can achieve a minimum score, and they'll be ranked, therefore, we'll talk about that later in the presentation, but it gives us two opportunities to make sure that we're advancing equity for both pools of individuals who may have had some harm from the industry and for those who may have not, but still want to help advance equity. Next slide, please. So the equity category is really important here. Within the equity policy, we take a deeper dive into 5 specific areas. So we look at local ownership, and local ownership is at least 25% interest in the underlying real estate where the business is located or actual ownership of the business. Whereas for workforce diversity, we look at for the first year, because a lot of people are just getting started with the recreational work, we look at what are your intentional strategies to recruit, hire, and promote employees who would qualify under the equity applicant definitions that we have and within the surrounding neighborhoods where they're located. After that year 1, we would then look at workforce diversity as far as what are your retention numbers, what does your makeup look like, who are you keeping, and how are you continuing to engage the community. For supplier diversity, we look at the annual spend and compare operational costs. So what all did you spend for your business and where did you spend that money with as far as micro local businesses, women-owned businesses, etc. For new business development, we were very intentional here because we know that there's a wide range of supports that can be given to new business development. So it could be as simple on the tier as a mentor-protege relationship, or it can be as deep of a dive as actual incubation along with mentorship and development of that business. It could be a cannabis-related business, or it could be a non-cannabis-related business. But we do want to see new business development because as business leaders in the community, you're best suited to help bring up other businesses along the way. And then lastly, our category is the Community Cannabis Reinvestment Fund. This fund will be able to pursue those equity goals that we identified earlier as being a focus for us. We'll be able to go into neighborhoods of focus and communities that have had a lot of negative history with the war on drugs, and we'll be able to make positive investments via loans and other things that we couldn't typically do as the city of Grand Rapids. So really excited to see that come. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Lou Canfield, and he's going to explain how the point system works to each of the categories that I just outlined for everyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to explain this slide and then I'll be back to talk about licensing later. But just in brief, the cannabis social equity policy includes quite a bit of detail on a point system. And so Sierra just described the 5 categories, and those are listed in the table on this slide. So each of those categories includes a range of commitments. So think of percentages or dollar amounts. And so each of those includes multiple ranges along those dimensions. And commitment or performance within that particular range, or each particular range, can earn points that correspond to that level. So in local ownership, for example, a certain level of commitment could lead to 2 points. And then within that category, you can see the table includes a weight column. So those 2 points would be weighted according to a value of 3, leading to 6 points in that category. And that same math applies for each category and each weighting. And so a total of 45 points is possible if the maximum in each category was to be earned. And a level of 20 leads to a designation as an application advancing equity, which then results in certain benefits and priority for that applicant. I do want to note that a person or an entity that wants to participate in this program needs to complete a cannabis industry social equity voluntary agreement. We're using the acronym CICEVA, so when you hear us refer to that later, you'll know what it means. That would be the commitment document used to affirm that you want to commit to that particular level of points. And then that document becomes legally binding and enforceable. So it's voluntary to participate, but then once the decision is made to participate, it's a binding commitment. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Kristen Turkelson, who will talk about zoning ordinance changes and their applicability to the industry.
Thank you, Lou. So as I mentioned previously, on July 7th, the City Commission did adopt a zoning text amendment that authorized land use regulations for recreational marijuana. Those regulations were broken down into a review process, so director reviews and special land uses. Director reviews also means administrative or staff level review. So those applications generally that qualify for an administrative review include growers, processors, secure transporters, safety compliance facilities, and co-located retailers within the industrial zone district, providing that they're less than, I'm sorry, that's supposed to say 5,000 square feet, not 5 square feet, less than 5,000 square feet of gross floor area. So there are certainly a number of caveats to that statement, so I would definitely refer you to the specifics of the ordinance to understand whether your application would qualify for a director review. Those applications that qualify for special land use, which means it would need review and approval by the Planning Commission, really center around the retailers and some of the larger grow and processors within our non-industrial zone districts. So the recreational retailers that wish to either co-locate at an approved provisioning center or a new retailer would definitely need zoning approval from the Planning Commission. Important to note some of the changes if you're in the industry and familiar with the City of Grand Rapids ordinance relative to medical facilities. New recreational retailers, whether it's co-located or new, are not eligible to carry forward any waivers that were sensitive use waivers that were granted in association with a provisioning center. and new retailers may not be eligible for a sensitive use to apply for a sensitive use waiver. So that's a significant change from the land use regulation structure that we set up for the medical marijuana applications. So separation distances and sensitive uses are intertwined within our land use regulations for marijuana generally. So separation distances is a distance between certain cannabis uses and sensitive uses, or between cannabis uses. And so there's quite a bit of discussion that went into informing the original ordinance relative to medical marijuana, where we, based on industry standards for zoning land use regulations for marijuana, there's a lot of description, a lot of information that suggests that there are certain sensitive uses that need an added layer of protection from certain industry types. And that's true both at a state level with liquor licenses. There's a lot around adult use, adult entertainment uses as well. So we carried forward some of that logic and said that there are certain uses that are deemed sensitive in the city of Grand Rapids. That would be considered religious institutions, substance use disorder facilities, residential, not residential, K through 12 schools and child care facilities. So those uses have a certain buffer, if you will. Under the old ordinance, we allowed for that buffer to be waived. However, under the new ordinance for recreational retailers, we do not. So those are important distinctions to understand, and certainly the City of Grand Rapids Planning Department can help get into case-specific questions on those. But largely, we look at the sensitive uses and the preservation of that use or protection of that use. But also, this model was chosen to help control proliferation of the industry. And so with any industry in a business district or in a community, proliferation of any one use tends to have a detrimental impact on the economic viability of that district. And so this was a way to make sure that we were able to control any potential proliferation. Next slide, please. So from a process standpoint, applications that are eligible for the direct review, administrative review, we will have an application window of July 20th through 31st. And then applications that require special land use, or the recreational retailers more specifically, have an application window of September 1st through 11th. Again, that structure is similar to what many of you may have experienced under the medical marijuana application process back in, I believe it was 2018, 2019, where we had an application window. Once the window closes, city staff will review that application for completeness. We will also look at any commitments made and associated with a social equity policy. And then those point structures that Mr. Canfield mentioned, the points will help inform the process that we will use to review. And so review the land use applications and the licensing applications. And that's with the higher number of points would be scheduled for review first, and then the lower number of points would be reviewed subsequent. Any applications that are not submitted in those windows would be reviewed after all of the applications in the queue or in the applications that were submitted within the window. However, we will not be able to review those prior to November 1st. Next slide, please. So I've already mentioned, upon receiving the application, we look to make sure it's complete, as we do with any submitted land use application. We then verify if the applicant qualifies as an equity applicant, and that helps determine, again, the order of review and processing of that application. And then we would also verify the social equity point system and the commitments that are made. So the process, I mentioned the application window. So once we have that queue set, we then look at, in August 2020, those that qualify for an administrative or director review. We would review the equity applicants and tier 1 applicants, those that achieve 40 or plus points. Those would be reviewed in the order that I've mentioned, with highest points first in August. In September, we would review tier 2 and 3 applications, and in October, we would review tier 4 and 5 applications. So the structure is really set up to incentivize participation with the social equity plan. The special land use applications that are, again, specific largely to the recreational retailers, that application window, once that closes, we would have the same review for completeness, et cetera. And then we would schedule those applications based on the number of points, with the highest points being reviewed first, along with equity applicants, Equity applicants would be reviewed first, and then we will be reviewing the highest number of points scored on the equity plan. I do anticipate that the Planning Commission meetings will begin in October of 2020. I'm hesitant to give a definitive date because I simply don't know how many applications will be submitted, how long it will take city staff, and then we also have a notification requirement to meet for the state requirements for zoning laws. And so what I can try to commit to is that it will be in October, whether it's the first or second Planning Commission of the meeting of the month will be largely dependent on the number of applications received. But certainly our goal is to begin that review process as soon as we reasonably can. Next slide, please. So I did mention a little nuance that was fairly significant from the medical marijuana application. So recreational retailers, I'm calling this out because there tends to be a greater amount of interest in this specific industry than the others. And we certainly have more provisioning center licenses approved than we do for the others. So any retail applications that are not co-located within the IT will require special land use. And again, that's specific to a 5,000 square foot GFA. If it's greater than that, then it will require special land use. I mentioned that the land use application or land use approvals that have been granted for provisioning centers to date, any waivers, sensitive use waivers that were granted for that provisioning center do not automatically transfer. There is no path for those to transfer. So there are 7 provisioning centers that have been approved to date that do not have a path forward to co-locate a recreational license. There are 13 standalone provisioning centers that did not require any sensitive use waivers. So those 13 at this time will have a path forward. In addition, the current ordinance that we adopted on the 7th, no new cannabis retailer may obtain a sensitive use waiver. So addressing that is part of that deliberative conversation that I've mentioned to see whether or not there's a policy desire to allow those 7 applications to be able to a path for them to make the ask. What I would at minimum anticipate is that the ability to transfer a waiver from a provisioning center to a co-located retailer would be part of the special land use consideration of the Planning Commission. So at minimum, there would be a process. I do not envision any sort of automatic transfer or carry forward. And for those of you familiar with this process, you'll know that the reason for that is any of the land uses granted to date or the sensitive use waivers were really specific to medical facilities. And so as a planner, I really feel like, you know, what we've committed to the community through that process is really important to respect. And so that is the main reason why I do not believe it's appropriate for waivers to transfer forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Canfield to go through the licensing requirements.
All right, thank you, Ms. Turkelson. So I'll cover kind of the high-level parameters of the city's cannabis-related municipal licensing program on this slide. So a city-issued license is required for all cannabis establishments, 1 per type, and they can be co-located or stacked. So imagine a combined growing, processing, provisioning center business. There would be at least 3 licenses and perhaps more if there were stacked growers. The program is administered by the city clerk's office, at least in terms of the mechanics of it. It does involve multiple departments for the review process. So think of planning under Kristen, building inspections, fire department, others. There is a $5,000 license fee, and it's the same fee for renewals. However, we are intending to prorate the initial license because we want to get the expiration date aligned with the state license. And so that's likely for almost everyone to lead to a fractional first year. And licenses are not transferable between business entities. So if a property is sold, if a new business moves in, that would need to apply for a new license. Next slide, please. Talk about application timeframes. So the application form will be available online, at least as a PDF later this week. It will, if not this week, soon thereafter be available as an electronic form. I do want to emphasize the form is the easy part. It's just 2 pages and it's pretty basic information on the business and business activities. The more time-consuming part is going to be to prepare and gather the various attachments, which I'll get to in a few minutes. That you can get started on any time if you haven't already, and it's likely to take a number of hours to prepare and gather those. And for retail businesses and any medical businesses that have not yet applied for zoning approval, you shouldn't be thinking initially of submitting a license application. Even once the form is available, you'll need zoning approval first. If we get a license application before the required zoning approval, it's just going to be put on hold. So there's really no need to rush that in right away. Applications will be accepted starting next Monday for medical cannabis facilities with prior zoning approval. And I do want to note, for those who have been operating, their zoning approval has been serving as a temporary license, and it will continue to do so until permanent license issuance, as long as we receive a complete application by August 20. Then we get into a grace period where if there's some issue with the application, we can spend some time resolving that issue with the applicant, but we do have to receive the application and all attachments by August 20th for us to consider that temporary license to still be good. And other types of facilities, those that don't yet have zoning approval, must obtain their local license before they begin operating. Next slide, please. So what are the ongoing requirements for licensees? They'll need to adhere to any of those SICEVA, so that's the Cannabis Industry Social Equity Voluntary Agreement I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to repeat all the words of these acronyms every time. And then MyVita, which some of you may be familiar with from the past, but that was the point system that was used to set priority order for Planning Commission review of medical marijuana businesses a year and a half or so ago. So they need to adhere to MyVita and SICEVA commitments. If applicable, as in if a business committed to do something under SICEVA, there will be quarterly self-reporting. Businesses will need to make a good faith effort to meet their social equity plan objectives. We'll get to that a bit more in a moment. They'll need to enroll in the Grand Rapids 2030 district for energy performance reporting. There's some illumination efficiency requirements for at least some of the plant canopy illumination. And then there are some other state and city requirements related to security, potential inquiries and investigations, inspections, and then all of the requirements related to employee access, patrons such as age. I think it's at least 21 to be able to access the marijuana sales portion of the business, and a number of other things. So need to pay attention to all those state law and city code requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you're ready to apply, if you either have a medical marijuana business that already has zoning approval, or and that that application could come in anytime on or after July 20th, or in the future, get zoning approval for a medical business. Here are all the things that you need to think about before you apply. And so you'll need to review the cannabis social equity policy. You will, and that was adopted by the City Commission on July 7th. If participating in the social equity program, you'll need to complete that SICEVA form. That's what involves the point system that I described earlier. That's part of the policy. Sierra went over in more detail. If applicable, so if the business that is applying for licensure had provided MyVita commitments, they'll need to provide a MyVita compliance form. Business will need to create a social equity plan that addresses all of the topics in that particular section 7369 of the licensing ordinance. That's the local ordinance. From an energy standpoint, you'll need to create an analysis of predictive energy load and an environmental sustainability plan. So those are all of the things that are likely to need to be created if they don't already exist. And then there are a number of attachments that will be needed, and they're all listed here. So they relate to zoning, state approvals, possession of the property, security, insurance, and then building occupancy. Next slide, please. Renewing looks quite similar to the initial application. So the form, the license renewal form is going to contain essentially the same things as the original application, and then a subset of those documents that had to be submitted as attachments. So if applicable, in future years, we'll need the SICEVA and or MyVita compliance forms. Both of those may apply if the business is committed to both. An updated social equity plan, updated sustainability plan, proof of compliance with environmental sustainability reporting, and then a copy of the state license, updated security plan, and insurance. Next slide, please. So how do equity and licensing relate? The social equity policy, again, the one that Sierra covered earlier, provides for incentives in the renewal process based on the business's equity performance. So up front, we're interested in your equity commitment. For renewals, we're interested in the actual performance. And license applications and renewals will be ranked based on the number of points. That will lead to higher priority processing for equity applicants, and so highest priority processing for equity applicants, and then priority processing for the applications advancing equity. And multi-year licenses will be available for those that have an established track record and have made significant equity commitments, and up to 3-year licenses, local licenses, will be available for those who follow through on major equity commitments. Those are defined in the policy. And that translates into a renewal, a reduction in license costs on renewal of up to 66%, because you're paying for 1 year but getting 3 years. So there's a bit of a financial incentive there. Next slide, please. All right, and I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Ms. Turkelson for the final slides.
Thank you, Mr. Canfield. So the next step in our process, as we mentioned on the 20th, we will begin accepting applications for those that qualify under the administrative or director review. On the 21st, the following day, we'll go back to City Commission during the day to have a facilitated conversation for the items that were scheduled under what we call the deliberative track. And those are largely listed on the bullets below. And from there, we will continue to process applications based on the window application dates that I've mentioned. And then also depending on what results from the July 21st deliberative discussion with City Commission, I do anticipate, that we will have another round of amendments that will be carried forward through August and September that will be needed as to implement the deliberative track decisions that are made. So those are some of the high-level next steps that we will be taking. So certainly through the fall, we'll be very busy with all things related to cannabis and processing of applications. So I believe with that concludes our presentation, and we are here to assist if there's any questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been just a chock full presentation. Hello, everybody. And there was a question earlier that came through that I just want everybody to know, everybody who's on the call, this presentation is recorded right now and will be posted for you to look back for future reference. The question was, will we be able to have this tangible conversation again, and being able to look at it and, take in the content, you know what I mean? Because there is a lot to go through. So one question is, as the folks on the call, you might know that we give the opportunity to send in early bird questions. And so I have the early bird questions for those who you sent something ahead of time. And this question comes from Harold. It says, does one need to have a Michigan license before applying to become a marijuana grower in Grand Rapids?
A Michigan license as in?
So a cannabis license?
I assume so.
So under cannabis license, yes, until December 6th of 2021, there are limitations as to who exactly can apply for a recreational cannabis license. And so I believe it's Class A growers and micro businesses are the exceptions, that you do not have to have a medical cannabis license to apply for a state license for those two industries. The other industries, the other growers, processors, retailers, secure transporters, in order to obtain a recreational cannabis license, you do need to first have the ability to obtain a medical license, cannabis license.
Would there be any other licenses that they need to have besides those that you speak of?
Not that I'm aware, no.
Okay.
I will admit I'm not an expert on the state licensing requirements, but.
Honestly, me neither, but I think none of us are, and that's why we're all on the call today, right? So Harold, if you have further questions regarding that, please, put something in the Q&A. One moment, please. So something else that had come through was how many, straight up, just how many cannabis facilities in Grand Rapids, how many cannabis facilities is Grand Rapids going to allow?
So that's not a number that I am able to give definitively. And the reason for that is because the city of Grand Rapids made an intentional decision not to choose a licensing cap. So we didn't set out to say there will only be 50 licenses for cannabis, for the cannabis industry. We chose to use zoning. And through zoning, we designated different zone districts that the use types are permitted in, as well as separation distances between facilities and between sensitive uses. We also had the waivers that are eligible for medical facilities. And so that rubric, is that the right word? All of those work together to determine what parcels would be considered eligible, what parcels would be considered eligible with waivers. And then, of course, when we have buffer requirements between facilities, that adds an additional layer of that helps speak to the number of facilities. So I realize that that's not a great answer, except that is the reason why I can't give you a specific number.
No, it definitely does provide context, though. So will existing medical cannabis holders have top priority for recreational license?
So I think I can speak to the only facilities that will be able to apply for a license and actually obtain it starting in July are the existing medical cannabis facilities, because everybody else still needs to get zoning approval. And so, they're welcome to apply, but they're not going to get a license. The application's just going to sit on hold. So yeah, I think that just naturally is going to lead to the existing medical businesses being prioritized for licenses first. Now, it is important to keep in mind that if we receive multiple applications within a short time frame, say on the same day, we're going to process those first that have made commitments under that SICEVA that have submitted that form or that are equity applicants. So there's some further prioritizing that can happen there.
What should a local entrepreneur know if they're starting today? Today, I guess. What exact steps do they need to take?
So I think
A lot to learn.
you know, I like any entrepreneur, I would always recommend being familiar with the planning and zoning department, because ultimately the zoning ordinance dictates where different businesses can locate. And so understanding that geography as to where a business could locate, I think is one of the main first steps to understand what the city regulations are. There's obviously a lot to understand at a city level. And as Sierra mentioned, you know, having those incubator spaces and helping support new starts into the industry is part of the effort or the objective of the social equity plan, because there is a lot to learn. But I would say as a first step, understanding what are the zoning regulations and where could a potential business locate would be the step I would recommend first.
Okay. So an anonymous person who sent you that question, if you have a follow-up question, please put that into the Q&A. And also, I see that we have some Q&As coming in right now. Everybody who's on the call, go ahead and just fill the Q&A up, right? It's all right to have too many questions. We'll take care of them. Does the city of Grand Rapids have projections for what the market will look like for potential medical licenses converting to adult use? So projections of potential medical licenses converting to adult use. What estimates does the city have for the number of equity applicants, tier 1, advancing equity applicants, etc.? Would you like me to repeat that?
So I think I can speak to the first part of that question. It would be, of course, completely speculative on my part, but based on conversations that the city has had with the industry, I will not be surprised at all to learn that all approved medical facilities will be seeking to co-locate a recreational license in association with their medical. I'd be surprised to learn otherwise. So with that, we have 13 standalone provisioning centers that would be able to add or co-locate a recreational license in the city of Grand Rapids. So there's 20 that have provisioning centers that have been approved, but 13 have the ability to add the retail license because they did not require a waiver. So remember that 7 that I mentioned are still a little bit in limbo at this point. I believe we have 7 growers and processors that have also been approved within the city. And I'd have to look at my data, but I believe at least 4 of those facilities, 4 of those 7 growers and processors have a co-located provisioning center associated with it. So again, I would anticipate that those co-located facilities will also be seeking to add a recreational license.
Because there's anything to lose, right? From a business perspective, right?
It would be speculative on my part, so I'm sorry. I probably turned to the industry folks on this call to answer that. But again, based on what we've learned through this process and research and conversations, it certainly seems like a more sustainable business model to add a recreational license type to their facilities. In terms of how many we anticipate will be equity applicants versus tier 1 applicants, I'm not certain, based on my recollection of the applications that we've received thus far, if we will have many of the existing approved medical facilities qualify as an equity applicant. But keep in mind, this wasn't solely to address current facilities. This does have broader applicability for future decisions. I don't know if Sierra, you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it really great, Kristen. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is, I don't know. Okay, we'll try. How many medical licenses are currently approved and operable?
So there are no permanent licenses issued. Kristen, do you have stats on medical by establishment type?
I do. I don't know that I can pull it up immediately, but I did mention that we have 20 standalone medical provisioning centers, 13 of which would be eligible to co-locate our recreational retail license. And I believe we have approximately 7 provisioning centers and processors and 2 approved secure transporters. So I think ballpark, we have approximately 30 facilities total that have received land use approval, and many of which I believe are working through the state licensing process, and also the building permit process.
Thank you. So Eric asks, will a medical applicant be approved to apply for local licensing and still be able to receive a waiver for the medical application land use?
Yes, so the only restriction on waivers is specific to recreational retailers. So the waiver process at this point has not been eliminated. So a new medical provisioning center, for example, could find eligible parcels and obtain a waiver if they go through that process.
Eric, if you want to follow up with that question, please feel free to. Who scores the application advanced equity? The city clerk office?
That will be a joint effort. So the planning department will be the recipients of the applications for land use, which will include the social equity plan. And I anticipate that it'll be a team effort between Sierra's department and the development center and the city clerk's office. So I hesitate to say that it'll be one person or one department that will be solely working on it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kristen.
Well, and Sierra and Kristen, you can chime in on what I'm about to say, but I think it's also important to note that for year 1, the ask is for commitments. And so, if someone says they're going to commit to achieve a certain level of performance in one of those categories, we're going to assume they've decided they can do it. And so the scoring, is not a subjective thing. It's, what have they agreed to, and do the math, and then it adds up to a certain number of points. So I don't want people to think it's like grading, a blue book essay or something like that. You're gonna submit some numbers to us, and we'll verify that they add up to what you say they add up to. It's in subsequent years where businesses are going to have to prove they did what they said they were going to do, and that's where there's going to be documentation required, and there will be more. Then there is more possibility of they provided this thing. In questioning, like, does that equal what they committed to? But that is a question more for a year from now. It's really not something that we're going to be working on next month.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
Jillian, I think I accidentally answered Mr. Foster's last question. I thought I misunderstood, so I was trying to clarify. So I'm not sure if you want to ask that question that I just answered online as well.
Right. Oh yeah, I see it here. Oh, you're at the beginning, Kristen. So Eric asked, for the audience who haven't seen the question, Mr. Foster asks, do any of the grower or processor local licenses have an application waiver attached to their land use that would prevent them from pursuing a companion recreational license?
And the answer was no. None of the approved growers and processors, medical growers and processors, required any waivers. So all of the approved facilities would be able to co-locate a recreational retail license, a recreational license subject to the various zoning approval processes, which is largely dependent on their location.
Then I'm gonna take one more question from the early bird. So if anybody in the audience, if you have a last burning question, now is the time to ask it, because oh, great job, Anonymous. And then I'm going to be wrapping it up soon. So just right now, this is the last shot. So someone's curious about local ownership. And this anonymous question was, of the applications on track to becoming established businesses, what percentage are local POC?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear all of them.
Oh, excuse me. This question from the early bird said, of the applications on track to becoming an established business, what percentage of them are local POC?
So I think that question being asked is what percentage of approved medical applications are from persons of color? I don't
believe so.
So if I understood that question right, we don't have that data. It's not appropriate from a land use perspective for us to request that type of information. Land use, good or bad, requires us to have equal treatment. And so we are not able to base land use decisions on who. So whether it's a person of color or not, it's just not information that's relevant to a land use decision. So long answer, short answer is we don't have that information.
Thank you, Kristen. And thank you, participant, for having that curiosity. I'm sure that as you come through the process of the social equity piece that they were speaking about, you'll be able to have a deeper knowledge of what the city is doing to work with that. So thank you, Anonymous. Last one was, when will the nonprofit be established? And that was the last question, final question.
Sure, I'll take that one. So we are currently in the process right now of going through the necessary steps to formulate the nonprofit. It will be several months because there are several components to getting established with the state of Michigan, getting tax exempt status, leadership, etc. But we are underway and looking at finding answers to all of those questions.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to everybody who's been on the call. Lou, Kristen, even Al and Sarah, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you've been taking to talk with us and the audience today. So folks, if you want to follow up with specific policies or ordinances that I've been speaking of, follow these two links. And you can either take a screenshot or our follow-up email to you will have these as well. And for particular questions, Al Romero-Gibo can direct them accordingly. So for following this next coming week, we're going to be talking specifically about what they talked about with the sustainability and energy management focus that has to do with relicensing. If you had caught that at the beginning, we're going to have Allison Sutter and Joelle Oliveira speaking. So make sure you mark your calendars for this time next week. And there's going to be a survey coming out that will have basically, it's essentially, was this helpful to you? What did you learn? And what more do you want to see? Because we're very receptive to what the feedback you could bring back to us, because we want to make sure that your questions are answered. So, excuse me, and as well as the recording and the resources that they've provided will be given as well. Thank you again to our visionary supporters, and thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Lou and Sierra and Kristen, for speaking with us today. And everybody, thank you for coming, and I hope you have a great day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.